Okay, I'm Doug Vincent Lang. I'm the Commissioner for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. I'm glad you're all here. What an honor to speak in front of you. King salmon. So to me, Alaska's iconic fish. The name King's kind of brings back its royalty in Alaska's fisheries as also its importance. But I think we need to spend a little bit of time looking at the history of Alaska's fisheries before we go into king salmon. Just remember, at statehood, our salmon fisheries were decimated. We fought for statehood to get control of our salmon fisheries and to regain management as a state to rebuild those salmon runs and provide for our economy, our culture, our food security, our recreational activities, and our commercial fisheries. That was a hard-fought battle. We won it. As a result, we've rebuilt those runs. We've established really a world-class fish and game management agency. We've instituted a board of fish that ensures public input into our fishery management programs. We have spent a lot of time in working in partnership with other groups. We can't do this alone, we recognize it. But we have a partnership that ensures that we're going to rebuild these runs. And look, since statehood, there's no question about it. We've rebuilt our runs overall. We have some of the most vibrant commercial fisheries in the nation, in the world. And we're doing an excellent job. We have a sustainable fisheries management policy. We've instituted escapement-based management. We are doing the right things. Now, that's not to say every one of our fisheries is meeting every one of its escapement goals, but we are much better off having a state-managed fishery than we are having a federally managed fisheries moving forward. And finally, I want to credit our delegation. You heard Dan, all the efforts he's doing. Lisa's doing very similar efforts, and I know Nick Bagage is in the background. He's working on Marine Mammal Protection Act issues. We couldn't do this without the support of our delegation. So I just want to make everybody know that we really support and really appreciate the partnerships that we're having and moving forward. So now let's get to king salmon. Kings have the longest life history of any of the salmon species in Alaska. You know, they spend 8 months in the gravel, 1 to 2 years in freshwater after they emerge, 3 to 6 years in the ocean, and then several months upon their return and getting into the spawning areas to spawn again and repeat the life cycle. All these life stages have incredible amount of susceptibility to environmental impacts. And because they're long-lived, the longer you live in those environments, the more susceptible you are to them. So, you know, while pink salmon and chum salmon can relatively respond quickly, king salmon take a little bit more time to respond. In juvenile, you know, we know that predation affects juvenile salmon. Look at the Kenai River. We now have some very vibrant rainbow trout populations as a result of the number of sockeye we're putting in there. We're trying to figure out and understand the impacts that those rainbow trout may be having on some of our juvenile Chinook salmon in terms of predation. We also know that seals are predating on our juveniles when they head out to sea, as well as on adults coming back. Warm temperatures are having an impact. King salmon, look at the Yukon River. Warm temperatures are clearly having an impact. These fish are cold-blooded. When they're going into the freshwater environment and they're having warmer temperatures, their energy demands go up and they're not eating. So it takes a lot more energy to get up to the Yukon border, the Canadian border, and they just simply don't have that energy to make it up. Disease is having a huge impact. We found out that in the Kenai River, in the Yukon River, Ichthyophonus is killing a large proportion of our fish that are between Pilot Station and the Yukon border. So again, that's an impact that's much more prevalent in longer river systems than it is in shorter river systems. And habitat, you know, we were trying to restore habitat on this Kenai River, for instance. We heard concerns many years ago about bank angling, so we've instituted a riparian management plan, but habitat clearly has an impact, and in some areas of our transboundary rivers, we're seeing a lot of mining in Canada, and we're working with Canada to try to minimize some of those impacts. And then floods, you know, you got gravel in the, you got eggs in the gravel, and you have a fall flood event, that can have an impact. Adult marine impacts include predation by marine mammals, competition in the ocean with hatchery fish. We've heard that loud and clear. We're going to have a panel on that to just talk about that. Bycatch and intercept. You know, everybody is, I think, I've never seen the amount of concern over bycatch and intercept that we currently have. But we're taking steps through the North Pacific Fishery Management Council to address that and through the Board of Fisheries. We took steps in Area M to reduce the chum salmon intercept for the Yukon, and we have very strong controls on king salmon intercept in our trawl fisheries, both in the Bering Sea and in the Gulf of Alaska. And then directed harvest. We're still harvesting, so everybody thinks king salmon are in trouble. We're still harvesting 400 to 500,000 king salmon in the state of Alaska. You know, if these things were clearly at the risk of extinction, we would not be harvesting 500,000 of these fish. A lot of these fish are harvested in Southeast Alaska fisheries. They're treaty fisheries shared with Canada in the lower 48, and it's strictly controlled, but our fair share is considered about 200,000 fish in round numbers. And most of our fish are caught in marine intercept fisheries. As we've seen a lot of these declines, we've taken very proactive steps in directed fisheries in river to try to ensure our escapement goals. But this last year, we've taken steps to reduce our marine harvest of those fisheries. I think I got a lot of complaints when I took steps to reduce the marine sport harvest during the summer months, but those are fisheries those fish are heading to our streams, and it's time to put them into the spawning bed. So we took a measure to reduce that harvest in an attempt to meet our escapement goals. And I think that's the most critical piece. We manage for escapement goals. That's different than the way the federal government manage. We manage to ensure that we're putting enough fish in the spawning beds to maximize the return of those fish. That's the other aspect of escapement goal management. We manage to maximize the yield. It doesn't mean if we're not meeting escapement goal that these things are at risk of extinction. We're trying to get them back to a high level of productivity. Thus, we were very opposed to the proposed listing of king salmon in the state of Alaska. Simply because we're not meeting escapement goal does not mean these things are at risk of extinction. They just basically mean that we're trying to rebuild them up to high levels of yield to provide for those economic opportunities, those cultural opportunities, and everything else. And I think overall, our management is working. Let's take a look at where we are this year. Southeast Alaska, 3-4 years ago, we were meeting 20% of our escapement goals. This year, we're on track to meet almost every one of them. Copper River, we're on goal to meet our escapement goal there. There's a little question about how we're counting, but right now, I think our sonar count gave us 28,000 kings into that river system. Kenai River, the early run exceeded the preseason forecast, did not meet the escapement goal, but it's on a trending upward direction. Late run, let's all have a hand over clock. We met our late run recovery goal of 14,250. That should be applauded. Our management is working to rebuild this run. We met the chicknet goal. That goal had not been met for years. We met that goal this year. North Alaska Peninsula, we met those goals. The Nushyak, it appears that we're on track to meet the Nushyak king salmon goal. And we met our king salmon goals in the Kuskokwim River. We're not doing as well in the northern Cook Inlet yet. We're still trying to figure out what's happening there, but we know we have some predation with pike in that system, and we're also struggling with some of these systems that have warm water like the Desha. Kodiak, we still don't know what's happening in Kodiak. We have pretty low runs coming to the Karlik and Ayakulik, which is interesting because we met the Chicknick escapement goal, but why the Karlik and Ayakulik are suffering, we don't know. Again, we think that might be temperature related. And then I think you heard Senator Sullivan talk about it, the Yukon. The Yukon is a long river system. Fish are suffering because of disease, ichthyophonus, we know that. We also know that they have a long way to go up that river system. Warm temperatures is affecting them. And we also understand that there are many other factors that, including habitat in Canada, that's of concern to us. We're trying to piece that puzzle together, but it's not a clear puzzle, and it's not a really easy puzzle to solve. We know, I'll tell you one thing, we know it's not bycatch. Let's take chum for an example up there this year. We were projecting to get 900,000 chums back. We got about 300,000 back. We're missing 600,000. Area M harvested maybe 200,000 chums. 70% of those were Asian chums, so we're talking about 40,000 chums that are going to go all the way up and down the entire Bristol Bay drainage, from Bristol Bay all the way up to Norton Sound. So maybe 20,000 Yukon chums. That's not the explanation of why we're missing 700,000 chums. We know those numbers really well too, and it just doesn't add up into those numbers. So we're trying to piece those puzzles together, and it's hard, but we're not going to give up on the Yukon, but it's going to be a long recovery. Then finally, I'm just going to end a little bit with what are we doing as a state? As I said, we're reducing directed harvest. You know, that's the one thing we can control very easily. I know it hurts everybody. Nothing harder in my job than to reduce opportunity for people to go out and go fish. But sometimes it's necessary to ensure sustainability. We're reducing bycatch and intercept at the council level and at the board level. We're studying marine factors. When I came in as commissioner, we really had a pretty good understanding of what was happening in freshwater environments, but we really didn't have any idea what was happening in that nearshore marine environment when fish were going out to sea. We instituted a marine science program. It's now a cement program in our department, and it's starting to yield some very good answers as to what's happening in that marine environment when they first go out to sea. We started juvenile studies. In the Columbia River, they have these little tags they put in juvenile salmon, and then they can pick them up where they're moving around in river as well as downriver. We've started that in the Kenai River, and we have 1 year now underneath our belt, and it's going to hopefully answer questions as to what's affecting juvenile mortality rates. Predation impacts, we're looking at that. We have some studies, and we're working with other people to follow their studies about the marine impacts and salmon predation from salmon sharks to marine mammals. We know it's a huge impact. The number of marine mammals in the ocean over the last decade has probably more than doubled, if not tripled. That's got to be having an impact on long-lived species like king salmon in the marine environment. We're updating our escapement goals. We routinely update our escapement goals every board cycle, and hopefully that's reflective of differences in size at age because we know that affects long-term productivity. And we're evaluating hatchery impacts. I know you got a panel on that, but we are actively involving in looking at the impacts of straying as well as food competition on our salmon. And then we're finally, I think Kevin mentioned it, we're working with people like the Gabriels to look at ways we can still have commercial fishing for other species while minimizing the impact on stocks of concern like king salmon with seine gear operations and other types of gear. And then finally, one other thing I'll mention regarding Senator Sullivan's remarks is we know it's going to be a long road to recovery for king salmon in the Yukon River. And as part of a negotiation with Canada, we're trying to rebuild their runs up into Canada. But we recognize that would, if we just completely cut off harvest opportunity in the lower river, that would have huge impacts on culture. So this year we did something kind of unique. We instituted a cultural permit in that river so that people can still harvest a very small number of fish to preserve that opportunity to pass on culture and subsistence opportunity. It's not food security, but it's passing on culture so that when those stocks are rebuilt, we haven't lost those cultural connections. So bottom line, you know, things are starting to look up for king salmon. It's going to be a road. Sometimes I wish I was Elon Musk. Had a rocket, just fire it up into space, and 2 weeks later, you can fire another one up because he figured out what was wrong. But it takes about 7 or 14 years to figure out whether what you're doing with king salmon works. So it's going to take time. I urge you guys patience, but we're on the right track and we're on a positive track. So thank you.
Hey, Doug. Yeah. So I'm going to get up next and do my thing, but a couple things about Doug that you should know other than he's one of my best friends as well. The average tenure of a commissioner, some states they call him director, in the United States is less than 3 years. Doug's going on 7. Doug's program is larger than probably any in the country besides maybe California. So, I mean, we owe him a debt of gratitude for that. The other thing, back in the 90s when Doug worked in the sport fish division and I was director, the issue of bank angling and boat wake degradation was very important on the Kenai River. And at that time, in a Alaska Board of Fisheries meeting, the board was on the cusp of closing bank angling, and they turned to us, Doug was there with me at that time, and said, well, what do you think you can do? And I looked over at the commissioner at that time, who was kind of in a quandary, and I turned and looked at the Board of Fish, and I said, I think we can reorganize so we can put about $200,000 into a study on bank angling and probably come up with some recommendations for closed areas. The guy over here did that, right on the fly, picked up the ball, ran with it, wrote the report, wrote the proposal that became the habitat management plan, that guy. So as I said when I was starting out, you're really getting a chance to look at some of the folks that have had their hands on the controls and done the work over the years. And I thank everybody for that. Craig, do you have any comments?
Yeah, you just stole the good thing I was going to say, since, they always, the old thing about reporters is they show up after disaster to shoot the survivors. I was going to mention the bank habitat, that if people here weren't here in the 80s, it's a different river. I mean, it was scoured bank to bank. There was an enormous amount of rearing habitat lost. And that river is in so much better shape today that he deserves credit. Kenai Sport Fishing, who put a lot of effort into that, deserves credit. So I just thought I would throw in a good word there.
All right. Well, I'm going to get up and hopefully not bore you with a story of Cook Inlet. The story I'm going to tell today doesn't go back to prehistoric times, but it starts on the year I was born, 1951. In 1951 and again in 1952, between 150 and 175,000 king salmon were harvested each of those years in Upper Cook Inlet. There were about 600 commercial drift gillnet boats out, there were set nets out, and it was before statehood, so we still had traps. One of the statistics that just boggles my mind is there were 174,912 kings harvested in 1952. I mean, the precision that it just, strikes me as kind of odd. But after that, harvests fell. They fell precipitously. And although the assessment program that the federal government operated was really weak at the time, it was pretty obvious that we were failing to put enough fish on the spawning ground. Situations, experiences like that are what led the state to do in the future what Doug talked at length about, and that's escapement goal management. Fish traps were closed, and we got statehood in 1959. Once we got management, we started to look at things we could do to improve the sustainability of king salmon. The set net fishery started out about May 25th, pre-statehood, gradually backed off to June 25th. During that early season, commercial fishermen were allowed to use 8.5-inch mesh gear, which was selective for king salmon. The gear changed over time to what it is today, mostly red salmon gear. Through the 1950s then and the 1960s and in the early 1970s, runs were low, escapements were minimal. There were some other things going on during that time. The birth of the sport fishery. In 1951, the road from Anchorage to Sterling was fixed up or was opened. The Alaska Railroad provided access to some of the Susitna streams, like Willow, Montana Creek. Very limited fishing opportunity for king salmon existed during those years. The sport fishery, it was mainly weekend only. It was below the railroad tracks up north. Same kind of thing on the lower streams. The Kenai was kind of a mystery because it was occluded and you really didn't have a good feel for it. Then I'm going to go first through a little bit in the valley and then come back to the Kenai, so I'm not going to be just jumping around. Up in the Mat-Su Valley, there were low escapements. I was scuba diving in Kodiak in the early 70s and came over to Cook Inlet about 75. So the count in the Deshka River, I'm going to use that as an example, was about 5,000 fish in 74 and 75. And then I started counting, and it's not because I have good eyes, I'm just lucky. But in 1976, we went from the 5,000, give or take, in 73, 74, 75, to 25,000. And then in 76, 77, it got up to about 40,000. And I started flying, it was an old Bell 47, and I'd come back in and I'd tell my superiors, I saw 25,000 fish out there. And they wouldn't believe me. In fact, the first year we came back and did that, they went out and recounted and came back with like 27,000. We put a weir in the Deshka River. When I say we, Alaska Fish and Game. And we found that what we were seeing out of the helicopter was about half of what was there. And in 2004, 60,000 fish went through the weir. Things started to kind of taper off about 2008, down to about 15,000. By 2020, 2024, they were down to the 3,000 to 5,000 again. And this year, we saw 1,600. So we've seen variation between 1,600 and 60,000. And as Doug pointed out, we've got some issues there. We don't understand what's going on, and we got a lot of work to do. Meanwhile, on the Kenai, of course, glacial water, you couldn't fly over and see fish other than in the early run up in the tributaries. So, yeah, we knew there were fish in the Kili River system and the Funny River system and up by Cooper Landing. And they were fish that moved into the fresh water in late May and June. And of course, they had kind of a free rein to go in because the set net fishery had been backed off till the end of June. Then, during the late or mid-1970s, again, I'm going to jump around a little bit here because the sport fishery changed dramatically. In the Kenai, people learned to fish out of a boat, drifting back, bouncing and such. And harvests went up. We learned a lot more. The management strategy during those years was sort of a one-third, one-third, one-third management strategy. The set nets took about a third, maybe 10,000 up to 20,000, that range. And the sport fishery did the same. And we thought that because we knew about what the exploitation rate was on sockeye, it was maybe about the same on kings. And so if you got 20, 20, and 20, you had a run of about 60,000. In the late 1980s, the department worked with some folks out of the Navy to develop a sonar unit that would allow them to distinguish between kings and sockeyes and start to count the kings. So we got counts in 3 years there in the late 80s and took that information to the Board of Fisheries. And those runs averaged about 45,000 kings of all sizes. And so we looked at literature that said in good conditions, in the freshwater, average conditions. In the marine environment, you get maybe 3 to 1 back. So the Board of Fisheries at that time said, well, 45 is the average, 15,000 is 3 to 1, what we need to get at least that average. And so they set up an escapement goal of 15 to 30,000, hoping to optimize future runs, but to protect the bottom end. And over the years, the sonar has moved from lower in the river to higher up in the river. The technology has gone from split beam to dual beam to these Aries things. I remember back in the first iteration, there was a sonar technician named Paul Skavorik. And Paul was so proud of his work, he said, I can not only tell you how big that king is, I can tell you if it's a male or female, and I know what direction it's moving. And we bought into that and found out that probably what the sonar was giving us is an approximation that was, a low number of fish that day, a medium number of fish, a high number of fish. But it's an exceptional program. I can't even explain how exceptional that is. Okay, I'm going to shuffle my cards here for a minute so that I get back on track. Runs in the Kenai remained robust through the late 70s, the 80s, and early 90s. As I said, somewhere around 50,000 would be a good average for that 30-year period of time. We worked hard with the Board of Fish to develop management plans that utilize that technology. Frankly, looking back, I think we were over-engineering things a bit, but in the late 1980s, the decision was made that there was basically a 3-piece to the management plans. There was going to be a green zone where, Katie barred the door, we were going to kill fish, and we did. There was a narrow orange zone where if we started to get worried, we'd tap down on things. We'd prohibit bait or go catch and release in the river, and we'd restrict some time out in the commercial fishery. That only happened once that I can remember, maybe twice, and it really raised an uproar because we had been living high on the hog. None of us in those late 80s believed that we would ever see the kind of closures we've had for the last 5 years here. So in 2012, that was the disaster year. It was the first year where we brought everything to a complete halt. And then we looked at each other and said, what do we do now? And the Board of Fisheries formed a task force that I was privileged to be on. And out of that task force came a management strategy that really worked in that orange zone about pairing restrictions between the sport fishery and the commercial fishery. And those are painful, and they've been troublesome, but they essentially work to put adequate numbers of fish on the spawning ground until this last period of time where we failed to meet our spawning escapement objective 3 years out of 4 or whatever it was, and the Board of Fisheries was obligated to designate late-run Kenai king salmon as a stock of concern. So that stock of concern plan, we put a lot of work into that. We really looked hard at selective harvest strategies, and there's a lot of work to be done there. Catch and release, restricting bait, time and area, depth of nets, fishing on tides. I'm not going to go into all the detail. I just want to say that a tremendous amount of work and time have been put into this. This whole decline in king salmon and managing around low abundance is not taken lightly. I want to reiterate what Doug says. We're really proud of our management program, and we're not afraid to close fisheries, but we don't want to. Where do we go from here? I think on these early runs, it's simple. I mean, there's not a real competitive thing other than maybe some marine conditions. We got to put every fish we can on the spawning ground. We got to protect the habitat. The late runs were here in the Kenai or on the Copper River or on Nushagak that happen at the same time as a really viable commercial fishery. There's a lot of work to be done. A lot of engagement has to occur. We have to develop selective harvest strategies. We have to manage to protect our habitat. We got to put as many fish on the spawning ground. And I think we got to kind of change the way we look at king salmon. It's great. We're still killing 500,000 of them and feeding America. But, the ones that get in a place like the Kenai River, they have to be very gently handled. And we got to make that escapement goal, and we got to hope ocean conditions improve. So I'm expecting minor increases in abundance over time, but with what we've got going in the ocean, I don't see us having a inflection point like the mid-70s ever again. I'm positive of one thing, and that's that left to our own devices, that's Alaska Fish and Game, Alaska Board of the Fisheries, and Alaskan fishermen, we're going to bite the bullet and put fish on the spawning ground. So thanks. Doug or Craig got any questions for me? I'll try to handle them, but otherwise I'd like to hear Craig's critical thinking.
Well, I'm not going to go back to 1951. It's true. It was a year later. I think so. I agree with most of what you said, and I am going to say something else nice about the department before I, start shooting survivors. When I got back to Alaska in the 1970s, was not long after the department closed the mixed stock fishery in Icy Strait, and which almost got some biologists killed, and shutting down the set netters here, which was not pretty, which was necessary, is probably the bravest thing I've seen the department do since then. So nobody liked it. I didn't like it. They didn't like it, but it was the right thing to do. think we have a bigger problem than just what fisheries biologists have focused on for decades, which is in-river issues. We've always worried about them. We worry about floods. We worry about warm water. We worry about all of that. We clearly have some marine problems. May have some marine problems in Cook Inlet, which certainly has some carrying capacity. And we have a lot of fish, a lot of young fish going into Cook Inlet now from the Kenai, the Kasilof, a couple of big years of pinks in the Kenai. Do they compete with those North End fish, and do they have an advantage, and does that influence what happened this year in the Deshka? I don't know, but it'd be interesting to start to find out. As for kings themselves, I pulled up some data the other night. When I came back to Juneau in 1977 to work for the Empire, there was a guy named Howie Ryder who caught a 93-pound king salmon down at Kelp Bay on Baranof Island, which was then the world record. The average size of a commercially caught king, which gives some kind of bar of how big kings were, in those years was 19.52 pounds. It started to slip after that. When Les Anderson caught his fish, was 97.4 and knocked Howie out of the rider slot. That was down to, 18.69, which is not bad, and it held that way for a few years. In fact, for quite a few years. By 2007, average had fallen to 15.25. A decade later, it was down to 12.1, and last year it was 10.1. Something is happening clearly in the ocean that we're not getting the big fish we used to get back. We've become very good at producing low-value salmon, i.e. pinks, to some degree chums, but we've somehow lost the most important fish to us. And I think there's a whole lot of discussion to go on there as to whether, and maybe we're stuck with it, it may be climate. I mean, there clearly is an advantage to warmer water for pink salmon, and we may have to live with this. We may never see again what we saw on the Kenai. And for those of you who missed it, well, I spent a morning on the Kenai, I think it was in the late 80s, with the late Bob Penny and the late Russ Reddick, who was regional sportfish supervisor at that time. When we started real early, because Bob Penny was like a, get out of bed at 4 a.m., we're going to fish hard kind of guy. And we were back bouncing, which was then legal. And I don't think from then until about 11 o'clock, there was a time someone didn't have a fish on. And we were releasing 40, 50, and one that probably would have gone 70-pound kings because we're after that 100-pound fish. And we quit at 11 exhausted. And it's just amazing to me how good it was then and where we are now. It's just, I don't think we're ever going to get that back. I don't think the ocean's going to allow that. But the question is whether we can make it better. And Kevin, you want to weigh in there?
Yeah, thank you, Craig. And, those of us that were out in the field, I was working in the Susitna drainage almost exclusively during that time. Deshka, Alexander, Talshalitna, up in the Talkeetna drainage. I would just reiterate what Craig said. I had 20, 30 fish days. But that brings me back to where I stopped before. I mean, even if we get fish back, do we want to just be that cavalier? Do we want to, count success by the number of fish we hooked and released? And hook and release mortality, if you're careful, might be, between 5 and 10%. If you're sloppy, it's probably a lot more than that. But that's not the subject. The subject is just, are we at an inflection point here where we have to rework things a bit and look at a less harvest-oriented fisheries in river, more selective harvest in our commercial fisheries, and there's other things too. We've experienced this year probably the best fishing for sockeye salmon you're ever going to have in any river. Don't count on that happening again. But, you know, the public is now very aware of sockeye salmon availability, and they're, you know, hooked on it, no pun intended. So, you know, that genie's probably not going back in the box. But there's just, in my estimation, we're sort of at an inflection point where these discussions that were difficult to have in the past just have to be had.
So I think it's clear something's happening in the ocean. You know, we're seeing king salmon are coming back smaller at age and younger at age.
Mm-hmm.
So younger at age means that we're not seeing those 7, 6-year-old fish coming back. We're seeing 4 and 5-year-old fish come back. And they're coming back smaller. So if you're a king salmon living out in the ocean, you don't want to be out there because you're coming back younger and you're coming back earlier. So why is that? Well, we know salmon are cold-blooded. So when you're out in the ocean and you're swimming around as a king salmon, spending 3, 4, 5 years out there, you know, it's, as the temperature warms, your energy demands go on. You're on a treadmill out there. And if the ocean, as a warmer temperature, has a different kind of diet makeup or different kind of food sources out there that's not as nutritious as it was when it's colder, you're on a treadmill eating less nutritious fish. So you're losing weight. So it's not a good place to be, so you come back early and you come back younger. Is that food competition from pinks and chum? Is it food competition from the number of sockeye we're putting out there? We don't know, honestly, we don't know. We know the number of fish that Alaska's putting in the water is pretty immaterial compared to the number of fish that are being put in the water from other jurisdictions. And we have data on those biomass estimates, so we don't suspect that it's really our fish that are causing major hatchery impacts out there, but we don't know why these fish are out there. We know that sockeye are benefiting from environmental change. We know that they're lake oriented. The Bristol Bay, we're putting more fish in those lakes. Those lakes are becoming more productive. They can have higher rearing capacity. You can't tell me when we got 70 million sockeye back into the Bristol Bay system a couple of years ago, to get that number of fish back, we put out 1.8 billion sockeye smolt, about this big, into the Bering Sea ecosystem in a period of time, April and May, probably a little bit of March too. That's a time when crab larvae are in the Bristol Bay watershed. I mean, in the Bristol Bay marine environment in a larval stage. That's a stage when we have king salmon going out and chum salmon going out. And these are big fish. Sockeye are winning a climate battle out there. The impact that's having on king salmon, we don't know yet. But
Russian pink salmon are doing pretty well out there too.
So we have a pretty good understanding what's happening in freshwater environments, especially as we're starting to add our knowledge with juvenile salmon. We have a lot to learn out in that marine environment, and we're not giving up on it, but a lot of that is beyond our jurisdiction. We had the International Year of the Salmon that added some incredible insights. We found out that we didn't have a significant overlap in where we found king salmon and pink and chum salmon, which was kind of interesting. But we really, the number of king salmon is relatively small compared to those other numbers, but we didn't see significant overlap, which taught us. But that was a snapshot of one, maybe half a year that we really learned something. We need to continue those kinds of big marine surveys, but they're not something we as a department can do because we don't have those big vessels out there. We need those NOAA vessels out in those deep water areas doing those surveys because we can't glean any information without surveys. So, yeah, environmental change is changing things.
There's a ton of things that would be nice to know, whether those fish, use the same areas year after year, whether it moves around based on water temperatures. I mean, it's a big puzzle.
Craig, I got a question for you. You've left yourself open, whether you were at the Alaska Daily News, the Dispatch, or now on your own, inviting people to call you and give you harass you, give you their opinion. What have you noticed over the years? Has it changed? How's the tenor? Just tell us about that if you can.
I think more people have come to offer opinions with less information. And I think it may be a reflection of social media that people who used to call me were pretty knowledgeable and upset that something was wrong, and they're often right. I mean, you boil things down and it gets messed up and it just isn't quite right. And now it's just, I think a lot of what your new sport fish director was talking about was people are just mad because they didn't get their fish. Something's wrong because I didn't get what I wanted. And I, I think that's kind of a social construct that is across the board of people. I mean, I don't want to use this word, but I will. They're just more selfish about everything.
Well, we've been friends since the late 70s, and I've probably followed your writing as close as anybody. And I think you have been able to keep a really good finger on the pulse of what's going on over those years, and thank you for that.
Well, I hope I did.
We're going to close it here, kind of where we opened it. There's a Pink Floyd song called I Wish You Were Here. There's a line out of that that I particularly love. It's lost souls swimming in a fish bowl. You're looking at 3 of them.